Good afternoon, everyone. We hope that you are doing well today. My name is Andra Gillespie, and on behalf of the staff and the visiting fellows of the James Weldon Johnson Institute, I'd like to welcome you to today's JWJI Race and Difference colloquium session. Today, we are pleased to have Dr. Edlie Wong from the University of Maryland. Dr. Wong is professor of English and director of the Center for Literary and Comparative Studies there. Prior to joining the University of Maryland at College Park in 2010, she taught at Rutgers University. She's the author of Racial Reconstruction, Black Inclusion, Chinese Exclusion, and the Fictions of Citizenship, and Neither Fugitive Nor Free, Atlantic Slavery, Freedom Suits, and the Legal Culture of Travel. She's also the co-editor of a scholarly edition of George Lepard's The Killers. Her work has appeared in journals such as Social Text, American Literary History, American Literature, and African American Review, in anthologies including The Haitian Revolution and the Early United States, American Literary Geographies, and The Image and the Witness, and online at Open Democracy. She's been the recipient of fellowships from the NEH, from National Endowment of the Humanities, and the Mellon Foundation, and she serves as current vice president of C19, the Society of 19th Century Americanists, and on the Modern Language Association's Elections Committee and the Executive Committee of the late 19th and early 20th Century American Literature Forum. Dr. Wong's teaching and research interests include 19th century American, African American, and Asian American literatures, law and the humanities, and critical race studies. Her current book project is titled Empire and the Black Pacific, a record of the darker races, and she's going to be speaking on that subject today. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Edlie Wong.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much to everyone who made this virtual visit possible. So let me start my screen sharing so I can start the PowerPoint. There we go. So I've adapted this talk to the video platform. It's roughly about 38 minutes long. And I've actually created a PowerPoint of many images to go along with this talk. So I will begin now. So this talk is drawn from a new project that mines the pages of the earliest and most influential of Black American literary magazines, the Colored American, hold on, I'm sorry. Let me do this. There. The Colored American magazine and its southern rival, the Atlanta-based Voice of the Negro, to investigate how Black writers and activists address the emerging links between U.S. race relations and colonial policies in the Asia-Pacific. In his 1899 address before the American Negro Academy, W.E.B. Du Bois marked the first year of U.S. war in the Philippines. Quote, the colored population of our land is, through the new imperial policy, about to be doubled by our ownership of Puerto Rico and Hawaii, our protectorate of Cuba, and the conquest of the Philippines. What is to be our attitude toward these new lands and toward the masses of dark men and women who inhabit them, he asked. Du Bois's question animated Black American print culture and literary production in complex yet largely understudied ways. Established in 1900, the Boston-based Colored American magazine witnessed the transformation of the U.S. into a global power. It grappled with the question of how to represent, engage, and position Black Americans in a world that was at once becoming more vast, heterogeneous, and integrated. Race remained a powerful structuring principle, yet it accrued dynamic new meanings in the age of new imperialism. These self-identified race magazines published a range of materials aimed to influence how readers came to understand themselves in relation to the global development of the color line. Among its new features, the CAM, for example, prominently publicized S.E.F.C.C. Hamedoe's Interesting History and Biography, which promised to introduce readers to the, quote, lives of certain of the colored race who are but little known in America, end quote. Intended to boost subscriptions and expand readership, Hamedoe's series was the first and most ambitious feature addressed to expanding the magazine's international scope. Hamedoe's new series also contributed to an emerging Black American discourse on the Pacific as Asia became more geopolitically significant to the US over the course of the 20th century. Gretchen Murphy and John Grusser have helped draw attention to the broad range of CAM publications on the Asia Pacific with their recovery and republication of Captain Frank R. Stewart's short stories based on the US military occupation of the Philippines. Stewart's Pepe Anti-Anting, Starlick, and The Men Who Pray represent a small fraction of the many CAM and voice publications on the Asia Pacific, which range from former bondsman turned journalist T. Thomas Fortune's The Filipino, a social study in 3 parts, and Benjamin Griffith Brawley's poem, New Wars, to Pauline Hopkins' Dark Races of the 20th Century, the 5-part ethnological series that she wrote for The Voice after her forced resignation from the CAM editorial staff. Colleen O'Brien has drawn useful attention to Hamedoe's writings as an index of Hopkins's editorial commitments to influence her readers' views of global class struggle and advance a, quote, collectivist model of international cooperation, end quote. Hopkins's emerging political worldview aligned her with figures like Du Bois and J. Max Barber, the editor of the more radical Voice. It also brought her into conflict with Booker T. Washington. His agents at the Colored American magazine sought to redirect Hopkins's editorial work from, in her words, quote, the broad field of international union and uplift for the Blacks in all quarters of the globe, to the narrow confines of the question as affecting solely the Afro-American, end quote. Hopkins's Dark Races numbered among the many new features that Barber promised to readers, including Du Bois's 4-part series, The Beginnings of Slavery. Like its predecessor, The Voice began commissioning work from leading race writers to fulfill its promise of providing readers with, quote, current sociological history and to grow its subscriber base. It offered a detailed synopsis of Hopkins's highly anticipated new series, urging that it alone was, quote, well worth a year's subscription to the magazine, end quote. Barber's recruitment of Hopkins also reflected his growing criticism of Washington's political ideologies as he transformed The Voice into a platform for the oppositional Niagara movement. Like many of her contemporaries, Hopkins's thinking on race and empire was in flux at the turn of the century. Yet her series on the dark races, united against the world color line, represents a major development of the racial theories that she first began exploring at the Colored American magazine. A growing number of scholars have assessed Hopkins' relationship to race, transnationalism, and empire, often with mixed conclusions. This talk shifts the focus of this discussion to explore the far-reaching influence of Hamedoe's series on Hopkins' internationalism and her turn to ethnology with the publication of Dark Races. Hopkins's emerging internationalist worldview likely drew her to the globally oriented discourse of ethnology. A science of racial difference, ethnology considered human development and relations on a global scale. It came into popularity in the 1940s and 50s as part of the 1840s, and 1850s, as part of the search for more scientific methods of human classification. As Britt Russert has argued, early Black ethnologies, a key, if often misunderstood genre of Black speculative writing, blended science and scripture to advance a monogenic theory of racial origins that imaginatively mapped descent and genealogy across the African diaspora. In Dark Races, Hopkins refits ethnology to the ambitious task of writing a new global race history. Quote, many are the lessons taught by ethnology, Hopkins proclaimed, but the grandest of them all is the lesson of the unity of mankind, the unity of common nature and a common destiny, end quote. Dark Races thus offers one of Hopkins' most complex meditations on the afterlife of slavery in the US and its evolving relation to settler colonialism, colonialism, Orientalism, and racial capitalism in the development of modernity. In this talk, I chart the development of Hopkins's engagement with race and imperialism, particularly in regard to ethnology, and as she appears to have been significantly influenced by CAM contributor Hamedoe. Numerous illustrations, key passages, and ideas from Hamedoe's work reappear in Hopkins's series. These highly suggestive connections beg the question of whether they were one and the same. Yet regardless of whether Hopkins created or read Hamedoe, her thinking as represented in her editorial choices and her own writings seized on imperial expansion's utopian possibilities to imagine new international solidarities to bring about the global resistance to racial capitalism. By charting the links between Hamedoe and Hopkins, I emphasize the extent to which Hopkins's editorial work helped shape and mask her literary production and political identifications. Pen names were common practice in early journalism, and Hopkins is well known for her penchant for pseudonyms. She contributed many unsigned editorials to the Colored American magazine, and it was not unusual for issues to feature her work alongside articles and fictions that she penned as Sarah A. Allen and as J. Shirley Shadrach. Pen names helped prevent the impression that Hopkins's work dominated the magazine, and Alicia Knight contends that these pseudonymous publications tended to be even more outspoken in their viewpoints. The first section of this talk explores the breadth and scope of Hamedoe's influence on Hopkins. The second focuses its attention on appropriative intertextuality in Hopkins's ethnological series. Such modern forms of self-referencing and borrowing situate Hopkins's dark races within an evolving Black intellectual tradition, even as the series challenged and renegotiated ethnological discourses of racial science that continued to inform the so-called Negro question in ever new and more pernicious ways in the era of overseas expansion. The series allowed Hopkins to experiment with various epistemologies of racial and historical knowledge in her efforts to formulate an understanding of Blackness that, like the episodic serial form, was open-ended, accretive, and non-cohesive. Part 1. From 1900 to 1904, the Colored American magazine published one short story and 17 installments of Hamedoe's series mapping the political contours of the emerging global South, from Haiti, Cuba, the Lesser Antilles, Ghana, Benin, Botswana, Zanzibar, Madagascar, Ethiopia, Afghanistan, and Thailand, to the newly acquired U.S. territories of the Philippines, Samoa, and Hawaii. Hamedoe's writings helped transform the CAM into an international publication with correspondence in, quote, China, Hawaii, Manila, West Indies, and Africa, according to one editorial announcement. Unlike the other serial contributors, Professor Hamedoe, as he was styled, was a largely unknown figure. There's no record of Hamedoe in any U.S. census, immigration, or birth records. Searches through various humanities databases yielded similar results. What we know of Hamedoe comes from two sources: CAM advertisements and Hopkins' much-discussed 1905 letter to William Monroe Trotter, editor of the Boston Guardian and co-founder of the Niagara Movement. Hopkins's letter referred to Hamedoe as a, quote, a paid contributor, and lists him among other, quote, true friends like William Lloyd Garrison Jr., Edward A. Horton, and A. Kirkland Soga, who had all, quote, gone to great expense, end quote, to provide material when Hopkins was hard-pressed for copy. Mimicking the hyperbole of the CAM advertisements, Hopkins described the author, Hamedoe, as, quote, a colored linguist who had mastered 7 modern languages and 13 Chinese dialects, and a traveler who had visited every corner of the globe, end quote. In September 1900, Hamedoe first debuted in the Colored American magazine with an article on the first Pan-African Conference, which gathered participants from all parts of the globe with the object of discussing and improving the condition of the colored race. His highlights from the historic conference emphasized the reframing of the so-called U.S. Negro problem as part of an international anti-colonial struggle of all oppressed races. Hamedoe's article drew heavily from an account published in the London Times. Such unattributed lifting was not uncommon for writers of the era, but Hopkins, as numerous critics have recently observed, relied heavily on this practice. The following the following issue launched Hamedoe's series, which began charting the global contours of this emerging Black internationalism. The series spanned the entire runs of Hopkins's 3 serial novels and 2 nonfiction series, Famous Men of the Negro Race and Famous Women of the Negro Race. As literary editor, Hopkins began forging even stronger links connecting racial justice, class struggle, and anti-colonialism. She also used her nonfiction series as opportunities to comment on the broader social and political issues of her times. Subtitled Some Literary Workers, Hopkins' 4th installment of Famous Women explains the urgent need for international content in the magazine. The race women of the new century, Hopkins writes, quote, must have an intimate knowledge of every question that agitates the councils of the world. She must understand the solution of problems that involve the alteration of the boundaries of countries which make and unmake governments, end quote. Hamedoe's long-standing series was dedicated to this task. Hamedoe's installments on the Caribbean, Africa, and the Asia Pacific throw into relief, quote, imperialism as the new global development of the color line, end quote. For example, General Dodds and the conquest of Dahomey moves from historical and ethnographical descriptions of the most powerful of West African pre-colonial states to the recent events leading to the French conquest of this African, quote, warrior nation, which is in present-day Benin. Hamedoe chronicled many of these once independent kingdoms of, quote, the colored race that fell during Europe's scramble for empire. In his installment on Madagascar, Hamedoe offers a detailed account of Malagasy, statecraft, and political maneuvering in the kingdom's futile efforts to stave off French colonization. In his discussion of the Boer Wars, ongoing at the time, Hamedoe foresees an eventual redistribution of global power. Quote, the many nations, he writes, who 50 years ago were loud in their denouncements of her, in this case, Britain's greed, are today among the foremost land grabbers in the world, and a universal clash will follow sooner or later, end quote. He notes the rise of new empires such as the US and Japan, and the prospect of future wars over territory and resources. Like Hopkins's Famous Men series, Hamedoe profiled mostly male public figures, often focusing on anti-colonial leaders from the African diaspora. Hamedoe's Menelik, Emperor of Abyssinia, would have captivated the attention of readers given Ethiopia's stunning success in the First Italo-Ethiopian War. Quote, Menelik was but little known to the Western world until 1896, writes Hamedoe, when the world was astounded by a Negro army managed and fought by this almost unknown king that humiliated one of the first powers of the world, end quote. Closer to home, Hamedoe's profiles of the president of Haiti, General Tiresias Sam, and Cuban revolutionary Major General Antonio Maceo offered more critical commentary on the ever-growing sphere of U.S. influence in the Americas. In Haiti, Hamedoe celebrates, quote, a government founded by Negroes and ever since ruled by Negroes, unquote, even as he voices concerns over U.S. neocolonial encroachment in this, quote, foremost Black republic in the world, end quote. Like Hopkins, Hamedoe appropriated biography to shape a global history of empire and resistance that emphasized the international aspects of the Negro question. Most significantly, Hamedoe's interesting history featured a richly heterogeneous visual record of the dark races. Hopkins later reproduced these illustrations in her series for the Voice. During her editorial tenure, the Colored American magazine was explicit about its use of images to advance the politics of visibility and representation for people of color in the US. It openly encouraged subscribers to send in their photos for its Here and There feature. Soga's South African periodical, Izwi Libantu, drew attention to these illustrations, describing them as worldwide and beautiful withal, comprising men and scenes interesting to colored people everywhere. Of the 23 illustrations accompanying Hopkins' Dark Races, 15 are drawn from Hamedoe's interesting history, and Hamedoe drew these illustrations from a wide range of works, including Lafcadio Hearn's 2 Years in the French West Indies, Bennett Burleigh's 2 Campaigns, Madagascar and Ashanti, and Presbyterian missionary reports from Siam and Laos. These titles number among the historical acquisitions of the Boston Public Library, an institution which Hopkins likely patronized. Hopkins' repurposing of these illustrations may have been a matter of convenience given her editorial access to these plates, yet a reliance on Hamedoe's illustrations, text, and sources hints at a closer link. Hamedoe's work reveals a heterogeneous reading practice that we have come to associate with Hopkins. Hopkins's first installment of The Dark Races features 8 illustrations with slightly different captions drawn from Hamedoe's Tamasasi and Matafa and 6 Hawaiian kings. He reproduced these images from illustrations that have first appeared in Edward Reeves's Brown Men and Women of the South Sea Islands in 1895 and 1896, in Queen Liliuokalani's Hawaii Story by Hawaii's Queen, which was published 6 months before U.S. annexation of the Hawaiian Islands. Rather than the typical depictions of semi-nude natives found in Pacific travelogues, Hamedoe offered a more complex visual construction of Hawaii. He included Queen Liliuokalani's formal portrait, along with the portraits of the late King Kalakaua and the Dowager Queen Kapolani, which highlight the modernity and continuity of the recently deposed Hawaiian monarchy. Hopkins' series later juxtaposed these royal portraits against Reeves's stock images of exotic Polynesians to heighten the dissonance between these portrayals. In the third installment of the Dark Races series, Hopkins borrows from Hamedoe's Ithamar, which featured 11 images drawn from Maxwell Somerville's popular travelogue and a compilation of Presbyterian missionary reports. Again, Hamedoe was drawn to the modern emblems of Siamese, Thai, sovereignty and power. He included 2 illustrations of King Chulalongkorn, whose statecraft and leadership have prevented Western colonization of Siam, in addition to other portraits of the royal family. In the final installment, in the final installment, Hopkins borrowed illustrations from Hamedoe's story of the Christian King Kham and King of Ashanti. She again juxtaposed a more conventional photograph of Africans in native dress against 2 very modern portraits of chieftains from present-day Botswana. Taken together, these illustrations create a heterogeneous visual record chronicling the world color line. They are also well suited to Hopkins's efforts to unfix racial typologies and move readers towards a more global understanding of racial politics. These illustrations challenge the visual archives of early racial science intent on fixing people of color into various inferior categories or types, as scholars including Sean Michelle Smith have discussed. Hopkins' Dark Races also drew its organizational principle from Hamedoe's series. Significantly, Hamedoe's exploration of the, quote, lives of certain of the colored race who are but little known in America, end quote, include the histories of U.S. continental empire and indigenous expropriation. Over the course of the series, Hamedoe connects the plight of Native Americans with the condition of indigenous people in the Pacific archipelagos, especially in Hawaii and Samoa. In Six Hawaiian Kings, Hamedoe references the only native Hawaiian chronicle of the Hawaiian monarchy published in the US. A singular text, Liliuokalani's Hawaii Story, challenged static colonial constructions of native Hawaiians and denounced annexation as an assault on self-government. Hamedoe's account placed particular attention to these political developments leading to annexation. By the time Liliuokalani succeeded to the throne, it was only a matter of time, Hamedoe writes, before, quote, another kingdom ceased to exist, end quote, and, quote, the stars and stripes were hoisted forever in the middle of the Pacific, end quote. As interesting history entered its third year in 1902, Hamedoe began to highlight ethnological considerations that were more muted in earlier installments. Hopkins also became more engaged with ethnology and racial science. She responded to these dominant discourses and converted them to her fictional use in Of One Blood, or The Hidden Shelf, which she began serializing at the end of the year. Contrary to biological racialists and eugenicists like Francis Galton, who remained convinced that racial mixing led to deterioration and degradation in civilization, Hamedoe, like Hopkins, viewed racial admixture, the consequence of slavery and empire, as a source of strength and vitality. Some of Hamedoe's ideas were later paraphrased and repeated verbatim in Hopkins's Dark Races. In 1904, Hamedoe published his only known work of fiction, Plixixit, a mixed-race Afro-Indigenous revenge fantasy reminiscent of Hopkins's Talma Gordon and Winona. Hamedoe's April profile of El Senor Jose Rizal would unwittingly become the final installment in his long-running series. Hopkins later revealed that, quote, Professor Hamedoe's article on El Senor Jose Rizal, the Filipino martyr, quote, had aroused, quote, Mr. Washington's wrath, quote, end quote, because it, along with another publication, quote, not only offended the South, but also seemingly reflected upon President Roosevelt's Philippine policy, end quote. As yet, the nature of Hamedoe's relationship to Hopkins remains inconclusive, but his series unquestionably shaped the direction of her thinking on race and empire. Part 2. By the time that Hopkins joined The Voice as a contributor, the monthly was striving to surpass the Colored American magazine to become the leading intellectual publication on the race question. Barber's ambitious editorial policy, as yet unfettered by Washington's censorship, consistently positioned the race question in relation to U.S. global power and the world color line. Within the first few months of launching The Voice, Barber organized a special issue in the Dominican and Haitian republics addressed to, quote, the question of annexation by this nation, end quote, and 3 other special issues, including a woman's number, appeared later that year. The Voice was far more politically opinionated on international affairs than the Colored American magazine, especially after its acquisition by Washington's agent, Fred R. Moore. Barber's opening remarks to the May 1904 issue, for example, described a disturbing New World Order defined by imperial war, white racial violence, and Western colonial expropriation. And here's the quote. In Manchuria, we behold the spectacle of 2 great nations praying for spring in order that they might plunge more deeply into the winter of civilization, war. In Tibet, England slaughters a people for the purpose of exploitation. In Southwest Africa, Germany is mutilating and murdering the black man and making chattel of his wife and children. In the Philippine Islands, our own country is benevolently assimilating the Moros with the repeating rifle. Add to all of this race antipathies, official stealing, sordid commercialism, and 100 other curses of the age. It looks as if the pendulum is swinging backwards. The world seems to hark back to the dark ages, end quote. The Voice also included a regular editorial feature, our monthly review, which covered national and world news, including extensive reporting on the ongoing Russo-Japanese War. Barber minced few words about his partisan coverage, insisting that, quote, "We are right in our position of siding with Japan, for Russia regards the dark-hued peoples of the earth as inferiors," end quote. Barber provided Hopkins with a far more receptive platform to develop her theories of race and empire. The new series also marked, according to biographer Lois Brown, a decisive shift in Hopkins's writing style as she adopted a more, quote, "forthright and unsentimental," end quote, tone to participate in these global discourses. Quote, "Many people have written us and spoken to us about Miss Hopkins's articles," Barber noted as the series progressed. Quote, "Evidently, they have awakened great interest in the history of the colored people of the world," end quote. In the age of new imperialism, ethnological discourses of racial difference helped facilitate the discursive transformation of colonial war into the benevolent mission of bringing uplift and progress to the benighted and uncivilized nations of the world. In 1890s, ethnology also underwent a transition as social Darwinism and eugenics came into popularity. Hopkins harnessed the instability of the form to challenge these new classificatory schemas. As Susan Gilman argues, the strategy placed Hopkins in the ambitious position of, quote, "challenging the claims in terms of science from within, of being, that is, occupied by such terms, yet occupying them oneself," end quote. Serial ethnology was oddly well suited to Hopkins's emancipatory project of theorizing difference. As Hopkins was well aware, anti-Black racism operated dynamically through the creation and suppression of difference. She draws attention to the ideological taxonomies of racial scientists who, quote, "separate the dark races endowed with European characteristics from any possible connection with the Negro, or more properly speaking, African race," end quote. By centering the dark races as a complex site of knowledge production, her new series considered the idea of a humanism that was neither post-racial nor transcendent. Drawing on Martin Delaney's Principia of Ethnology, Hopkins bases the origins of Black skin pigmentation in the coloration of blood. However, she gradually reformulates this biological understanding of difference in relation to empire and racial capitalism. The time, she avers, quote, "is ripe for a popular study of the science of ethnology, as the rise of new powers and the decline of old powers, the great expansion in the business world, or the growth of commercialism, the remarkable development of the imperialistic fever among governments has caused a searching of the obscure corners of the globe for world markets and for world conquests," end quote. Numerous critics have drawn attention to Hopkins's conflicted responses to race and empire, citing dark races as evidence of Hopkins's ambivalence towards imperialism in the Philippines. By situating dark races in relationship to Hamedoe's series, this talk highlights under-examined aspects of Hopkins's political vision of Black internationalism. Hamedoe's serial exploration of Western colonialism in the development of the global South identifies empire as the new world order. Quote, "It was no longer possible for any race or nation to go on absolutely by itself," Hamedoe reported in the first Pan-African Conference. "In this ever-shrinking world," he continues, quote, "how was the universal intercourse of man to be carried on in the best possible way," end quote. Like Hamedoe, Hopkins recognized that the world, reshaped by Western empire, was moving towards greater integration, and dark races grapples with the meaning of difference in a unifying world that remains structured in inequality. The global color line becomes the occasion for her inquiry into this question of color, what Frantz Fanon later theorized as the epidermal racial schema. By exploring how Blackness might be open to transformation and contestation, Hopkins develops an understanding of racial difference that might build and encourage collective action in the face of oppression. Hopkins' series begins with the indigenous peoples of Oceania, and later installments move readers along an eastward trajectory from the newly acquired Philippines through Asia and Africa to conclude with the North American Indian. Like Hamedoe's series, Hopkins bookends her studies with essays that link the earlier histories of New World conquest and U.S. settler colonialism with U.S. overseas empire. In Oceanica, Hopkins emphasizes the deleterious effects of colonialism on the native inhabitants of these remote archipelagos. As scholars have observed, Oceania was the, quote, last open field in the scramble for the world's resources and the last bastion of mystery in ethnology, end quote. Hopkins notes that the, quote, inhabitants of Fiji, a group of more than 200 islands, have greatly declined in numbers since white men brought them the vices of civilization, end quote. She ends with a description of the new frontier in Samoa and Hawaii. As with British civilization in Fiji, U.S. colonialism in Hawaii has devastated the indigenous peoples. Hopkins's final installment on the North American Indian develops his critique. Repeating ideas from Hamedoe's Osceola, Hopkins sets out to correct the erroneous, yet, quote, commonly presented picture of the Indians as hordes of wandering naked savages at the time of the discovery of America by Columbus, end quote. Insisting on a common humanity, Hopkins reinterprets earlier ethnological writings that justified the expropriation of indigenous lands and the genocide of indigenous peoples. She argues, quote, drive back to reserves and supported by the governments of the United States and Canada, the Indian is steadily decreasing, end quote. In Oceanica and the North American Indian, Hopkins portrays Western civilization and colonialism as a harbinger of indigenous destruction and a new necropolitical order. Hamedoe's subtle but biting criticisms of race and empire also help illuminate Hopkins' subversive manipulation of her ethnological medium. Her first installment begins by critically recasting Du Bois's world color line in the hyperbolic rhetoric of racial perils. Quote, we have in the opening of the 20th century perils, yellow and black, borne along on an unreasoning insanity on the question of color. Her acerbic, sardonic tone was likely not lost on her readers. In a promotional announcement, the Voice highlighted the rhetorical facet, noting that Hopkins' series would address the histories, quote, habits, customs, and locations of the several dark races now brought prominently before the world as perils to civilization. By 1905, Japan's stunning success in the Russo-Japanese War reignited fears over an imagined Asiatic threat to the U.S. and fueled debates over extending the Chinese Exclusion Act to the Japanese. Quote, since the war between Russia and Japan began, Hopkins notes, there has been great talk of the yellow peril, end quote. Extending Barber's notion of a new dark age, Hopkins appropriates eugenicist discourse to ironically portray the, quote, march of human progress as a declension of human civilization. And the quote reads, quote, centuries ago, the most civilized nations fell prey to barbarians who overturned dynasty after dynasty and completely changed the character of races and governments, thus placing scientists at fault in the 20th century in their attempt to classify the living races of their time. Those barbarians were known to the dark races who ruled the world then as the white peril. To those white barbarians, the civilized world of today owes the supremacy of the white races, end quote. Her barred manipulation of the threat of racial peril enhances the subversive subtext and destabilizing reversals that characterize her approach to the ethnological genre and her treatment of anti-Asian xenophobia. In subsequent installments, Hopkins began to push the speculative threat of racial peril to its limit, applying the disruptive potential of Black multiplicity to counter racist hierarchies of power. Hopkins' fourth essay on Africa, from June of 1905, folds the, quote, Negroes of the United States, end quote, into her discussion of Africa and the African diaspora. Further manipulating the discourse of racial peril, she begins by establishing the demographic dominance of the darker races. Quote, when we consider the fact that there are 1,300,000,000 people in the world, and that only about 375 million are white, or 1/4 of the globe's population, we are not surprised that the dominant race dreads a dark peril and sees in every movement made by leading representatives of dark peoples a menace to its future prosperous existence, end quote. Hopkins also repeats passages drawn from another of Hamedoe's essays in claiming that, quote, 10 million, end quote, people of the, quote, Philippines, Borneo, and Oceania, end quote, are part of the races containing Negro blood. Diverging sharply from Delaney's Principia, Hopkins, echoing Hamedoe, further includes the, quote, other dark races of Australasia in the family of Ham, end quote. Hopkins's ethnological claim was a strategic rejoinder to anti-Black ideologues like Senator J.T. Morgan of Alabama, who adapted biological racialism for both segregationist and imperialist ends. The Colored American magazine had reported on Morgan's controversial scheme to, quote, colonize the Philippine Islands with American Negroes, end quote, as a solution to the, quote unquote, Negro problem. A staunch segregationist, Morgan drew from ethnological studies that identified the Negrito, his words, as the, quote, original inhabitant of the archipelago in order to show that the islands are suited to the Negro race, end quote, as he put it. Rather than insist on Black distinctiveness, as did many Black commentators at the time, Hopkins reframes this, quote, presumed racial affinity between Black American and Filipino as a basis for an international anti-imperial alliance. Hopkins then looks to, quote, the Negroes of the United States, a heterogeneous mass composed of contributions from nearly all the tribes of the fatherland, end quote, to refute racist typologies that lump people of African descent into, quote, one vast mass of hideous ignorance, end quote. She calibrates this heterogeneous discourse of Blackness to accentuate further the, quote, dread fear of a so-called Anglo-Saxon race suicide with the decline in white marriage and reproduction. Returning to Hamedoe's demographic data, Hopkins draws a powerful conclusion, indeed rather a menacing one for white supremacists, imperialists like Morgan. Quote, this enormous number of men of the future, she observes, must yet be reckoned with, and the far-seeing Anglo-American realizes the problem on his hands, end quote. Hopkins positions people of color, the dark races, at the center of the world history yet to come. In Hopkins's series, Dark Races is synonymous with, even as it exceeds Blackness as a racial formation. As the series progresses, Hopkins brings more political considerations to bear on the ontological question of race and racial difference. Quote, how will capital and labor bear upon a question of ethnology, she asks. Our answer, she continues, quote, is that sociological conditions have more to do with the developing civilization than racial descent, end quote. She gradually moves readers towards an understanding of Blackness, uncoupled from the limited and limiting biological concept of race. In the final installment, she concludes that, quote, few tests for classifying races are more unsatisfactory than that of color, end quote. Culture, she proclaims, quote, is the only true test. Like Du Bois in The Conservation of Races, Hopkins defines race as a socio-historical concept and determines the primary significance of phenotypical difference according to culture, economics, and the law. She again draws attention to how racism operates through the creation and suppression of typologies of racial difference. Quote, if we let them tell it, she explains, the slightest advancement in art and science and government removes all traces of Negro origin. Therefore, East Indians, Indians, Japanese, Chinese, Arabs, Abyssinians, Zulus, and many others not classed among the members of the great family of Blacks, end quote. In this instance, a series of non-white yet purportedly non-Black racial categories, which include African-descended people like the Abyssinians and Zulus, are explicitly defined against the presumption of inferior Blackness. Hopkins shows how race is exploited as a negative category for the purpose of oppression. She continues, however, to hold on to an understanding of race as a positive category, one that may encompass a sense of membership and affiliation in the broader struggle against racial capitalism. In the series' conclusion, Hopkins envisions the possibility of a world beyond racism, but not beyond race. This new world order will demand a cataclysmic struggle, indeed a kind of Marxian world revolution. Quote, in such circumstances, she writes, the color of the skin, the curl of the hair, the development of the cranium will not count. We want men with red blood in their veins and not the sluggishness of the cold materialist who scorns the, quote, dreamers who make up the world's best people, end quote. Hopkins closes by hurling a parting shot at Washington's allies. After acquiring the monthly, Moore announced a decisive shift in editorial direction, declaring, quote, it seeks to publish articles showing the advancement of our people along material lines, believing that the people generally more interested in having information of the doings of the member of the race rather than the writings of dreamers or theorists, end quote. The stinging import of these words would not have been lost on Hopkins. Dating from Thomas Jefferson's Notes on the State of Virginia, the dismissal of Black imagination had fueled the development of early racial science and its pernicious racial hierarchies. In Dark Races, Hopkins's choice of ethnology was a powerful act of speculative imagination, and it performed important reparative work, forging links across the rifts and divisions of racial science. Hopkins's most significant work after the Colored American magazine excited a powerful language to express the shared descent and future struggles of all the dark races of the world. Her final completed series limns the global outlines of a systemic practice of Western economic exploitation and underdevelopment based on racism and forms of racialization. In its serial form, her ethnology imagines new and as yet emerging forms of collective belonging across the geographies of racial capitalism, moving toward what Cedric Robinson later called a revolutionary Black world consciousness. In Dark Races, Hopkins issues a call for the alliance of the, quote, thousands of Blacks, yellows, and browns who will teach the Anglo-Saxon that all men are created equal and that all men are not white men, end quote. The end. Okay.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Wong. We really appreciate your talk, and it's certainly going to generate a whole lot of questions. I'm going to start with the questions that I have, but if you do have questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function down at the bottom center of your screen to submit a question, and I will be happy to read it for you.
Thank you.
Our first question comes from Barbara Combs, one of our fellows, who said that she was really struck by the discussion of how Hopkins used portraits of people of color across the globe. Hawaii and Africa come to mind to contrast the popular mental and visual images of those people. And I wonder where that strategy, which I think is brilliant, came from. Can you talk more about it? What was her objective?
So part of my larger argument is actually thinking about Hopkins's work as an editor, and that the possibility, and I think increasingly as I do more research, there's more evidence that Hamedoe is Hopkins, that this was is as yet unacknowledged pseudonym for her. And so by using the kind of avatar of masculine kind of scientific knowledge or anthropological knowledge at the time, that she was kind of seeding the Colored American magazine with this really just dynamic and world kind of encompassing visual record of the darker races. And the more kind of research that I've been doing in relationship to the Colored American magazine and the Voice of the Negro, at the time, there were lots of debates about the naming of Afro-Americans or African-Americans at the time. And some of the kind of more conservative figures, including T. Thomas Fortune, really dismissed the idea of using colored peoples, colored races, or darker races for the very fact that it was too expansive. It was too kind of global encompassing. So there was this kind of Booker T. Washington infused kind of return to a much more nationalist focus by using the term Afro-American. And that was kind of part of the ongoing debates between these different kind of ideologies of Black internationalism, kind of in opposition or in tension with a much more kind of localized or nationalist understanding of kind of Black American identity at the time. And I see Hopkins as really kind of moving more towards the Du Boisian and J. Max Barber Niagara movement kind of perspective, in which she was really kind of exploring, experimenting with this really kind of capacious notion of the darker races. And in so doing, including just this vast archive of images. A lot of these images actually fall away from subsequent reprints of Hopkins's work. And so with Hathitrust actually digitizing and making publicly, well, for the most part, publicly accessible, sometimes you have to sign in through an institutional imprimatur in order to access the full kind of archive of Hathitrust, that it's making more accessible researchers to see these images, even in the kind of degradation that often digital reproduction creates. There's sometimes the reprints are not beautifully kind of captured. Sometimes you see other kind of material or fingers or hands in the process that kind of mar the images, but at least you see that part of what made these magazines so kind of exciting, and the Colored American magazine was the first of its kind, was the images. And in both the Voice and the CAM build themselves as illustrated magazines to draw attention to kind of the visual imagery, the visual aspect that was part of their kind of literary mission.
Hey.
Does that help kind of, does that?
Well, Dr. Quinn will certainly chime in if it didn't, but thank you very much. So the next question is from Michelle Gordon, a JWJI alum who is a faculty member in African American Studies now at Emory. So she writes, "This is so fascinating. I'm curious about why the Voice of the Negro is relatively little known. Why is this magazine so overshadowed in the scholarship still? Do you attribute this to its anti-colonial or internationalist focus, or to Hopkins' overlooked leadership as a woman?"
That is the exact same question that I had when I started reading all the issues of the Voice of the Negro. I had heard so much, there's been so much work on the Colored American magazine. I think a lot of it is with the recovery of Hopkins. I think a lot of the interest, the scholarly interest that's been focused on the Colored American magazine has so much to do with the kind of recovery and the reestablishment of Hopkins as a major literary figure from this period. What's interesting as I started reading through all these Voice issues is the J. Max Barber's editorial presence, and he had a really unifying vision. I mean, the Colored American magazine had that to a certain degree with Hopkins until 1904. And then there's a real radical shift when it's basically bought out by the agents of Booker T. Washington. And you see that the literary aspects and the more international aspects that Hopkins had kind of seeded into the magazine really slowly starts to shift away. Hamedoe disappears. And that's my part of why my early speculations that Hamedoe was another pseudonym for Hopkins is that all of a sudden this really fabulous, long-standing 4-year series just disappears, and he disappears from print history. But I think part of what drew me to the Voice is its incredible kind of articulation of Black internationalism. Its real interest in kind of global world events. And in fact, as I was reading through, there's the Our Monthly review section gets renamed as there's a beautiful kind of renaming of it with a gorgeous kind of I forgot the term for it, but a masthead that's called I think it's the World Highway is what Barbara then renames it when they move from Atlanta to Chicago, the Voice. And he prints an editorial from a reader who has stopped taking the Voice because didn't understand why you preoccupied yourself with so much international news. We should be focusing on the US. And Barbara has this real fulsome argument that the world is part of who we are, and that this kind of coverage of global events like the Russo-Japanese War, like other things that are happening around the world is essential to an understanding of kind of Black identity and Black politics that is both kind of local but also international in focus. So you really see the Voice kind of moving towards this really interesting Black internationalism, even as the Colored American magazine after 1904 starts to kind of refocus its energies and attention on much more kind of nationalistic, nation-based kind of issues that are equally important, but clearly driven by a kind of ideology that is much more kind of, in line with Booker T. Washington and a desire not to critique the kind of Roosevelt administration at the time and his much more bellicose, imperialistic kind of policies in the region and also in the Philippines.
Great, thank you. So this question is from Francine Allen. During the Black Arts Movement, there existed great concern among Black artists with returning to Africa, reclaiming a royal African heritage. How do you see Hopkins and Hamedoe's concern with Black internationalism standing in relationship to this idea of reclaiming or reconnecting to an African past?
That's a very good question. Thank you. I think you really see a lot of those elements in Hopkins's Of One Blood. And partly my effort to kind of rethink Hopkins in relationship to Hamedoe's kind of more quote unquote scientific ethnographical work is that she's really reading a lot of histories of Africa that were kind of available at the time. I mean, Hamedoe has a really incredibly laudatory discussion of Menelik and the kind of rise of Ethiopianism is happening around this time. I think Moses's notion of kind of Ethiopianism kind of really being part of the kind of Black intellectual kind of tradition from this period. You see Hamedoe's writing and Hopkins really giving expression to that. Hopkins, of course, I mean, critics have looked at her in terms of as part of a broader kind of Black ambivalence to the U.S. imperial project. And the work that I'm trying to do is also charting just the kind of incredible and impressive presence of African American soldiers in the Philippine American War with the 25th Infantry and other kind of volunteer units that were created to fight in this U.S. imperial war. And there are other scholars who've, charted the letters that the soldiers wrote. I'm looking at all the different writings, both fiction and nonfiction that the CAM, the Colored American magazine, published, really getting to the kind of ambivalence of what this means as part of this kind of broader U.S. imperial project. And I think it's very resonant with the Back to Africa kind of movements that you see later on with Garvey, but even, from a figure like David Walker in the much earlier period of the 19th century, where there's a lot of, Walker's kind of critique of the American colonization society, which in many ways was trying to produce this kind of idea of back to Africa, but as a kind of ploy or as a kind of trick of elite planters, white pro-slavery planters. So there's a lot of tension in terms of this idea of emigration, return to Africa. And in many ways, it's very similar, kind of analogous to the kind of ambivalence that you see with Black Americans participating in US imperial adventures abroad. A lot of the Colored American publications on the Philippines really explore, in fact, the idea of Black immigration to the Philippines, that the Philippines might offer a different space of possibility for those willing to seize it. And you see actually a number of former Black infantrymen, soldiers who fought in the war remain in the Philippines and kind of start new lives, at least, provisionally there, before returning to the US at a later point in time. So does that kind of
Well, I hope that if Dr. Allen will sort of let us know. So Dr. Hopkins did respond back and say that, yes, that you did answer.
Okay, thank you. It's a weird format.
Just said the same thing.
Talking into the void, so I'm sorry. I didn't cover everything.
So the next question is from Haley Harrell. She thanks you for such an invigorating talk. I am really interested in the suggestion that Hamedoe was a masculine pseudonym for Hopkins. And I was wondering if you could speak more to this gender performance and its relationship to race. Specifically, does Hopkins's Hamedoe solely speak to issues of global racism, or is there also a critique, or rather an investigation of gender entangled in this performance as well?
That is a very good question. If indeed Hamedoe is as yet unacknowledged pseudonym for Hopkins, it would be her first masculine pseudonym. All the other ones we know are female. They would have been legible as female writers, the pseudonyms. So I think there is kind of a really interesting question about gender performance happening, and gender performance that you see really kind of heightened in her tensions over her authority as an editor at the Colored American magazine. From the very get-go, the four kind of co-founders of the Colored American, or the cooperative, and the Colored American magazine had really envisioned her role as in the women's department. And you see that kind of tension in terms of women authorship kind of as part of Hopkins' career as an editor and writer at the Colored American magazine, culminating with a very dismissive kind of removal by Moore after the acquisition of the magazine, and the kind of shift towards a more Washingtonian ideology that a woman should not be, adding her voice to these kind of questions of politics. So I think the effort to kind of use Hamedoe as this kind of masculine pseudonym was one way that Hopkins, in a very tongue-in-cheek, in a very flip manner, was kind of seizing power. That she was able to kind of use the freedom that was offered to her in this kind of performance of masculine authorship to really write on topics that interested her, that many individuals from that period might have thought wasn't within her purview. That as a woman, she should be writing about these other topics, but not about world global events, about colonization, about Menelik, about Hawaii and Samoa and US annexation in the Pacific. So I really feel like in many ways the kind of performance of masculine kind of authority and through the pseudonym of Hamedoe opens up kind of literary vistas for her. If that kind of gets to, and it's something that I find really exciting, that when you read Hopkins, and a lot of the scholarship on Hopkins, I don't think gets at her really subversive humor. Because a lot of the folks who have written about the dark races often read it straight. But if you kind of read it with an attention, and you get this too with Hamedoe, there's these kind of turns of phrases, this kind of biting sarcasm, this kind of sharpness, where you see kind of criticism kind of emerging from something. And the dark races has these moments. And I hope you heard some of that in the kind of passages that I read. And I think part of that kind of play, right, the kind of ludic quality of Hopkins might very well be in how she's using Hamedoe as a pseudonym that no one seemed to be aware of at the time. Even when she writes about Hamedoe, it's in such hyperbolic terms. 13 Chinese dialects, he's traveled all around the world. If he had, it would have been able to find some kind of documentary trace of him, right? But no, there's no kind of trace of him. So clearly there's a kind of playfulness. And I feel like Hopkins is kind of almost kind of luxuriating in this kind of freedom. And this is what Alicia Knight says, that in fact her pseudonymous publications are much more political, much more vocal, where she felt like she wasn't risking, like Pauline Hopkins, her kind of identity, that she's able to kind of inhabit these other kind of writerly kind of avatars or egos, and that allows her a kind of freedom to be political, to be kind of critical, to kind of give voice to things that she, might felt she was more kind of bound by, for the writings where she took her own name, where they came out as Pauline Hopkins.
Yeah. So Dr. Combs came back in response to this, and so the comment was, "Wow, I really like thinking about it that way. That by taking this pseudonym, she's taking up a place that was denied her as a woman." So I especially get excited about that when I put the idea next to the quote from Hopkins that you read that said, "If we let them tell it, they will tell the story of inferior Blackness."
Yeah. I can only say that I agree. I think it's really exciting. I'm still a little hesitant about, I'm still collecting a lot of evidence. And part of, as I was talking to the fellows earlier, that, with the difficulty of travel and a lot of libraries being closed, I've been doing a lot of online digital archive researching, and I've actually gone through the Boston Public Library holdings, the historic holdings, and I've actually found almost all the intertexts, the titles of the intertexts, because part of the question is, how did Hopkins read all this? It's an incredible wealth of kind of knowledge that she kind of is able to accumulate in these essays as Hamedoe, if indeed she is Hamedoe. So the question is, where did she get access to these texts? Where did she access all this information? And my suspicion is that it's most likely she was at the Boston Public Library, which she would have been, it was a desegregated space at the time, turn of the century, so she would have been able to read these texts. And I was actually been able to identify almost all the titles that Hamedoe cites, either overtly or, is implied through reference, and they are all there at the library. And so that's my sense, is that she's reading voraciously. And part of the research really opens up this incredible kind of, library of texts that she is reading at the time, if indeed she is Hamedoe, which I think I'm feeling increasingly more confident in making that correlation and that claim.
Great, well, thank you. So just as a reminder, if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A section, a button or under the chat. We have another question from Dr. Allen. She asks, you mentioned that Hamedoe and Hopkins felt racial mixing was a source of strength and vitality. Can you elaborate upon that? On what basis did they see this strength and vitality deriving? Were Hamedoe and Hopkins talking about racial mixing among Black and white Americans, or racial mixing on an international level?
That's a very good question. So the work of fiction in which Hopkins is most explicit about the benefits of miscegenation is her detective fiction. It's a novella, Talma Gordon, where it's very explicit that the mixing of Black and white in that instance allows for a much kind of stronger, kind of more vital, kind of more vitality. And that really does run against the grain of a lot of eugenicists at the time that were advocating for anti-miscegenation, for kind of segregation of the races, because in fact, mixing pollutes, in the language of the time, pollutes the kind of stock of any given race, etc. So Hamedoe, some of the images that I showed was of his later contributions to the series, and increasingly he starts going into more depth with ethnologies of the time, and there's explicit statements where he makes the claim that miscegenation, mixing of the races, actually leads to vitality, for kind of stronger and does not kind of trammel in the language of deterioration, of degradation, that in fact mixing is kind of a source of power and change. And this is part of the problem of Hopkins and Hamedoe, because they both partake of a really racially kind of inflected language of ethnology. So this is part of the moment where I'm saying she's both kind of occupying and occupied by this kind of language of race, which of course is very kind of racist in its kind of construction, the eugenicist discourse of the time. But I see this as part of kind of Hopkins's kind of performative power, because she does things like take on the male pseudonym of Hamedoe. She's taking on ethnology, which is the most kind of masculine coded kind of scientific discourse of the day, but it was considered science at the time as well. So she's really kind of working different genres as well as kind of pseudonyms and playing with them and using them, and in many ways kind of converting them to her use, which is a kind of critique of eugenicist discourse. But she's using the eugenicist discourse in that process, just as she's kind of critiquing masculine literary authority by adopting a masculine pseudonym. So I see it as kind of, part of the kind of complexity of Hopkins and her kind of political and literary project. Does that kind of get to? So, but Talma Gordon, if you're looking for a kind of full-throated kind of Hopkins discussion of the power of miscegenation or the mixing of the races, that is the text that really kind of gives the clearest example of where she's moving towards. And that's a much earlier piece of writing. That's well before Of One Blood. It's like 1900. Yeah.
Right. So any more questions? Give everybody a minute or two. Okay, so I'm not seeing any more questions, and we're almost at 1:15. So I know you can't see everybody, but I will ask the audience to please join me in thanking Dr. Wong for her talk today.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for your questions. I mean, they're excellent. And as you know, this is a project that I'm currently working on. So all that feedback is incredibly helpful, especially as I'm kind of sitting in front of a computer, as many of us are by ourselves trying to figure things out. So thank you.
We're very excited about this project. I know that Rhonda Patrick has put in the chat our links to your previously published books. So yeah, we hope that we do that, and we look forward to seeing you next week. And so next week our topic is going to be the geographies of Latinx indigeneities. So thank you very much for your time today, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Take care.